Daddy, chill.
What the hell is even that?
Hello, and welcome to Relic Grove, a channel about old or under-discussed games. My name's Trent, and earlier this year I thought I was finished with Norse mythology-themed VR games after finishing Asgard's Wrath, but it just so happens that another game for this oddly specific platform and genre caught my eye. Crossings released on December 18th, 2025 for Quest devices, and February 6th, 2026 on Steam, the latter being my preferred platform. It was created by Neat Corporation, a developer most well known for Budget Cuts 1 and 2. I haven't played Neat's previous games, though they're well received, and Crossing's art direction and world intrigued me. Its Steam page describes the game as a roguelite with seamless ambient multiplayer, something along the lines of Journey, and it comes in at just $10. So how is it? There's very little in the way of story, so don't expect to be on the edge of your seat waiting for the next plot point to drop at the end of each run. What we do know though is that our enemy is fate, and it's our responsibility to defeat it. And so we fight our way through enemies in the Norse afterlife on a journey to kill the 3 Fate Weavers. We get a short little tutorial, and in true roguelite fashion, we're sent to die and then immediately start a new run. The combat system is simple, but it's also very fun to utilize the full kit at our disposal. Of course, being a VR game, we're given access to staple melee and ranged combat, but there's also a few wrinkles thrown in the mix as well. We have 3 magic spells at any given time, which we trigger through actually gesturing with our hands. I was a little confused on how to use spells at first, as the tutorial says to follow the statue's movements, but the statues here don't actually move, so it just took a bit of playing around. Another unique addition, like gesture-based magic, is the inclusion of directional-based combos specific to each melee weapon. There's 3 types of weapons we can use in close quarters: swords, axes, and maces, each of which can trigger certain effects if swings are executed in a certain way. These effects range from simple damage multiplication to elemental status effects. We can also just swing our sword around like a traditional VR game, though we'll find that's not very effective. In fact, making use of the unique combat mechanics in Crossings is paramount to success. Unfortunately, I found that the underlying physics accompanying melee weapons specifically didn't fully support the directionally based combat system. See, each weapon type is balanced differently, stats-wise and physics-wise. Swords generally deal less damage than axes and maces, but they are also much easier to swing around, tracking our real-world hands closely. Maces, on the other hand, deal more damage, but are much more difficult to lug around, slowly trailing behind where our hand is placed in the real world. The force used to swing a weapon is also ignored, and I found that my weapon would often bug out if I tried swinging my hand too quickly, as I would naturally if I was fighting a little goblin-esque creature. This means attacking with a mace feels less like swinging around a club, and more like gingerly moving around a stick that's experiencing input lag. The awkward implementation of physics clashes with the more arcadey directional input combat system, and makes it difficult to play properly, in quotes. I understand wanting diversity in weapons, especially since acquiring new gear in a given run is what drives a roguelite in the first place, but I feel as if it would have been better to have all melee weapons feel the same physics-wise, and instead have all differentiating factors be based on stats. Fortunately, ranged combat doesn't seem to have these issues, as the bow feels good to use. Unlike other VR games, it seems that the bow is shifted away from our face artificially, which sounds like it might feel weird, but this just means we can draw the arrow all the way back without accidentally hitting ourselves in the face. The downside of trying to use the bow too often is that there aren't enough arrows to allow us to do so. Projectiles are handed out sparingly, and even should we collect a large amount, our quiver is limited to 12 normal arrows or 8 elemental infused arrows, except for when I somehow got 9,999. I'm still not sure if this was a glitch or an intended feature. I'm not sure why ranged combat was implemented sparingly, as it's one of the more fun parts of the combat system. Sure, it makes getting up close and personal a necessity, which makes fights more tense, and that may have been what the developers were going for. Unfortunately, using a bow just feels a lot better than most melee weapons, so it also makes fighting less fun. The last combat mechanic I mentioned earlier, magic, is also pretty enjoyable to use. Spells certainly aren't enough to carry us forward on a run, and should only be used to complement a given situation. For example, making a squishing motion with our hands might be helpful in pulling all of the enemies in an encampment together with a quick burst of air. Following this up with a quick lift of the hands might send ice spikes shooting up from the ground, resulting in the collected group of goblinese folk being slowed and damaged. This also gives us the opportunity to mop them up with a few quick slashes or loose some arrows on them from afar. So, although some elements of combat might feel underdeveloped, putting all elements of fighting together can make for some really satisfying moments like these. Getting into a flow state feels great, and these situations are when Crossings is at its best. I've talked a lot about combat, but the other core part of a roguelite is the progression loop. Actually, although it's self-described as a roguelite, Crossings is much closer to a roguelike. I'm not gonna lie, I had to look up the differences just to make sure I wasn't going crazy, but a roguelite allows players to progress outside of a run, such as increasing health, improving weapons, etc., across all future runs. Roguelikes, on the other hand, reset progress after every single run without the opportunity to make base improvements to the player's stats, abilities, or equipment. The latter description is much more accurate to what Crossings is offering, as although there is a form of currency that is kept after each run, the only permanent unlocks that can be purchased with this currency are cosmetics. With that out of the way, let's talk about the actual intra-run progression. The offerings here are fairly par for the course as far as roguelikes go. Clearing an area of enemies usually provides a chest that might contain a weapon of higher tier or new useful directional combos. Killing enemies will also sometimes give the option to increase either maximum health or maximum mana. Health and mana are used to absorb damage or use spells as you'd expect, but they can also be traded into standing stones as we advance through the underworld. Trading in our health or mana will either give us charms that alter our stats or abilities, or an upgrade to one of our 3 spell slots. There's a pretty decent array of different charms and spells to collect, and they will definitely be necessary in the higher difficulties of Crossings. I had fun experimenting with different combinations of equipment and figuring out which were my favorites. Of course, each run is different from the last, with environments being procedurally generated. Environments are fun to explore for the most part, and I find the forest especially beautiful and cozy in a liminal sort of way. It's very atmospheric to walk through the Norse afterlife, the art direction here is really appealing, and the music complements each area well. The boss fight track especially slaps hard. There's a couple other environments later on, though they are more depressing compared to the calming Goblin Forest. It's important to explore as much as possible as well, as killing enemies and looting chests is how we'll become more powerful before confronting each boss and moving on to the more difficult areas. What we'll find through environmental progression is that the amount of enemies just goes up and up. There's definitely a learning curve here, and I got my butt kicked a few times before I really got a handle on juggling the different aspects of the combat system. Once I did though, delving further into the many little corners of Crossings became even more enjoyable. One of the main marketing points on Crossings' store page is the inclusion of ambient multiplayer that will just kind of happen while playing the game. For example, we should expect to just run into other players on our journey to defeat fate. In my experience though, I genuinely didn't run into a single other player. I'm not sure if that made things more difficult. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised, because by the time I unlocked the second difficulty, I was really struggling. But it didn't deter me, and I eventually unlocked and finished every difficulty. Well, almost, but I'll get to that. It's odd to me that I never encountered other people given how big of a marketing point it seems to be, but that may have just come down to the fact that it seems that the game didn't sell all that well. It's crossplay between Quest and Steam, but given the similar low review count between both platforms and the 24-hour peak player count on Steam, yeah, that's actually a lot more brutal than I expected. I didn't rely on the strength of others though, and forged on alone in a world seeking my destruction. Unfortunately, my first run was probably the most fun. Each successful run on a given difficulty will unlock the next difficulty up, but the ramped up difficulties didn't result in a change of scenery. There are larger enemy encampments and some slightly altered bosses and mobs, but enemy AI behavior remains largely the same, and environments are quite similar from run to run, irrespective of difficulty. At some point, it felt as though I'd seen it all. I would say there's not much reason to keep playing at the higher difficulties, but the ghostly narrator from the intro of the game told us that we must kill all 3 Fate Weavers, and so I intended to do so. I struggled and clawed my way through the second difficulty, which had a drastic spike in goblin numbers. The nice part about this is that it forced me to get better, which would help me as I finished off the second Fate Weaver. I felt more than ready for the final stretch after this. On my final run, for over an hour without pauses, mind you, as you can't save your spot in a run, I fought through countless hordes of trolls, draugr, and other undead creatures. Nothing could stop me as I mowed over anything standing in my way, sweat rolling down my face. I made it all the way to the final section of the game when this happened. I couldn't swing my weapon, couldn't cast spells, couldn't even heal myself. Nothing. It's as if I was made a ghost. And so, I could make my way to the end of the afterlife but I couldn't fulfill my destiny. And I died. And as I died, so did my will to continue playing Crossings. This wasn't the only glitch I ran into. Sometimes monsters would have their stun meter broken and would immediately be unstunned. Bosses might have gotten stuck in place, and other trivial issues like this would occur relatively frequently. But this particular bug really left a sour taste in my mouth at what should have been the end of my journey. I know enjoyment of a game isn't based entirely on if it sticks to the landing or not, or in my case if there's an ending at all, but my frustration with this moment really made me take a step back and think on if I even did enjoy what I played, or if I was just drawn in because there was a goal to work toward. Well, reflecting on it, there wasn't a clear-cut answer. There were a lot of highs in my time with Crossings. The art direction and atmospheric world design drew me in and kept me engaged. Combat was satisfying when utilizing everything in my toolbox, and seeing all the different enemies, bosses, and environments for the first time was an enjoyable experience. That said, there were just as many lows. Repetitiveness that really weighed the experience down, a melee combat system that was implemented poorly, an advertised multiplayer system that I didn't get to see in action at all, and a handful of bugs that ended up sucking all the fun out of the time I had invested. With all of that in consideration, on a scale of hate to love, with dislike, neutral, and like being steps on the way up that scale, I'm neutral towards Crossings. I was really excited for its release, especially coming from a prolific VR developer, and I certainly derived enjoyment out of my time with it, but there were just a few too many issues hampering my experience, and one that ultimately ruined it. For $10, if you're really intrigued by what you've seen here, and you're in the market for a VR roguelike that will occupy your time for around 6+ hours, then it might be worth checking out. Otherwise, your time and money would be better spent elsewhere. Thanks so much for watching and making it to the end of this video. If you're interested in more content like this, please consider subscribing. Take care of yourselves and have a good one.